Thunderous hooves churned the dust, a wave of bronze and hardened resolve crashing against the legendary walls of Athens. The year is 480 BC, and the mightiest empire the world had ever known, Persia, stands poised to swallow Greece whole. An empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, whose king, Xerxes, commanded an army so vast it was said to drink rivers dry. But in the face of such overwhelming power, a flicker of defiance, a belief in freedom, would ignite a fire that echoed through centuries. Welcome, and prepare to journey back to a time when empires rose and fell, and discover the extraordinary story of the Persian Empire. We'll explore not just their vast conquests, but the surprising ideals of tolerance and justice that defined their reign, and how their legacy continues to shape our world. Imagine a world utterly consumed by chaos. A mosaic of squabbling tribes, warring city-states, empires built on plunder and fear. For centuries, this was the reality of the ancient Near East. Then, from the dusty plains of Persia, a new force emerged. Not merely a conqueror, but a builder. A civilization that would forge an empire so vast, so organized, so enduring, it would redefine the very concept of power and governance. Look at this map. From the shimmering Aegean Sea in the west, all the way to the Indus River in the east, stretching across mountains, deserts, and fertile river valleys. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire. At its zenith, it was the largest empire the world had ever seen, dwarfing even the mighty Babylonians and Egyptians before it. It was an empire of unprecedented scale, but its true genius lay not just in its size, but in its soul. Picture the scene: the magnificent city of Persepolis, its colossal stone gateways guarded by mythical winged bulls. Imagine the vibrant throng of delegates from across the empire, Medes in their tall hats, Lydians in their colorful tunics, even Egyptians with their distinctive headdresses, all converging to pay tribute, to share knowledge, to be part of something extraordinary. This wasn't a brutal conquest, it was a carefully constructed unity. The Persians, unlike many empires before them, didn't seek to erase the identities of the peoples they ruled. Instead, they embraced them. They understood that strength came not from uniformity, but from diversity. Cyrus the Great, the founder of this colossal enterprise, famously declared, "I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four corners of the world." But his actions spoke louder than his titles. When he conquered Babylon, he didn't desecrate their temples or enslave their priests. Instead, he allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. A revolutionary act of tolerance in a world accustomed to brutal subjugation. The historian Herodotus, though often critical of the Persians, acknowledges this unique approach. He writes of their respect for local customs, their willingness to learn from conquered peoples, and their commitment to justice. They built roads, not just for armies, but for trade and communication. They established a standardized currency, a postal service that could deliver messages across vast distances in days, and a system of administration that allowed for local autonomy while maintaining imperial control. They were, in essence, the world's first truly multicultural superpower. But such an unprecedented achievement, such a bold vision of order and tolerance, could not go unchallenged. The very success of the Persian Empire would inevitably draw the attention of those who saw its might as a threat. And from the West, a different kind of power, a burgeoning civilization fueled by a fierce love of freedom and a burgeoning sense of its own destiny, was beginning to stir. How could this colossal empire, built on such a foundation of strength and righteousness, possibly fall? The sun beat down on the sprawling empire, a jewel box of cities, cultures, and conquered lands, all bound together by the legacy of Cyrus the Great, Darius, and Xerxes. 4 centuries, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had been the undisputed colossus of the ancient world. Its roads, a network of unparalleled efficiency, carried not just armies, but trade, ideas, and a shared sense of order across vast distances. Its administration, a marvel of bureaucracy, ensured a degree of stability and prosperity rarely seen before. Persian was the lingua franca of diplomacy, its silver coinage the universal currency. It was an empire built on the principle of tolerance, of allowing its diverse peoples to retain their customs, their gods, and their laws, so long as they paid their tribute and served the great king. But empires, no matter how grand, are not eternal. And even the mightiest of structures cast long shadows, fertile ground for the rise of new threats. Beyond the familiar, civilized lands of the empire, in the rugged mountains and windswept steppes, new forces were stirring. Forces that did not understand, or perhaps did not care for, the sophisticated order that Persia represented. These were the barbarians, as the Greeks would come to call them. Tribes of fierce warriors, their lives forged in hardship and constant conflict. They were the Scythians, the Massagetae, the Medes who had not yet been fully integrated, and others whose names would soon be whispered with dread across the satrapies. They were not an organized empire, not a unified state. They were a wave of restless peoples, driven by hunger, by ambition, by the sheer, unbridled force of their own martial spirit. The great Persian Empire, accustomed to facing rival kingdoms and organized armies, found itself ill-equipped to deal with this new kind of enemy. For these were not men who fought for king or country in the way Persians understood. These were men who fought for glory, for plunder, for the sheer exhilaration of the charge. They swept down from the north and east like a storm, their cavalry a blur of motion, their arrows raining down like a plague. The rich, fertile lands of Persia, once a symbol of its power and prosperity, now became a tempting target. The granaries, the well-tended fields, the bustling cities, all vulnerable to these sudden, brutal incursions. The carefully constructed walls of civilization felt increasingly fragile. The righteous might of Persia, once so assured, was now being tested not by equals, but by a force of nature, a raw, untamed power that threatened to tear it all down. The empire began to feel the strain. The borders, once lines of control, started to look like frayed edges, vulnerable to unraveling. The threat was no longer confined to distant skirmishes, it was at the very gates. And the question on everyone's lips was, could the legacy of the great kings withstand this new, terrifying shadow? Could the very foundations of Persia's greatness endure? The vast Persian Empire, a tapestry woven from countless cultures and peoples, hummed with an energy all its own. From the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the snow-capped peaks of the Elburz Mountains, its reach was undeniable. Cyrus the Great had forged this realm not through brute force alone, but through a vision of order, of tolerance, and of a justice that resonated across its diverse lands. This was the might of Persia. But beneath the gilded surface of palaces and the disciplined march of its armies, a new force was stirring, a righteousness that would soon challenge the very foundations of the known world. Consider the simple act of worship. In most empires, the gods of the conqueror were imposed upon the vanquished. Their temples defiled, their sacred objects scattered. Yet Cyrus, in his extraordinary decree, commanded otherwise. He returned the sacred vessels of the Jewish people, stolen generations prior by the Babylonians, and sanctioned the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't mere political expediency, it was a profound statement. It spoke of a Persia that respected the divine of others, a Persia that saw strength not in uniformity, but in allowing each people to flourish under their own traditions. This was the dawn of a new era, whispered in the prayers of those finally returning home, in the grateful pronouncements of those freed from exile. But this burgeoning righteousness wasn't a passive ideal. It had a potent, and sometimes startling, manifestation. The Persians, for all their tolerance, were still warriors. Their elite fighting force, the Immortals, were a legend whispered in fear across battlefields. 10,000 strong, their numbers were always maintained, a constant, unyielding tide of bronze and disciplined fury. Their armor, a gleaming testament to their mastery of metalwork, reflected the sun with blinding intensity. Their arrows, fletched with feathers of every hue, darkened the sky like a swarm of locusts, each one carrying the promise of Persian dominion. Yet, this formidable military machine was now imbued with a deeper purpose. It was the instrument of a justice that sought to right ancient wrongs, to impose order not for its own sake, but for the sake of a more equitable world. This vision, however, was not without its detractors. The established powers, accustomed to their own brutal hierarchies, watched with growing unease. The old empires, their foundations already shaken by Cyrus's lightning campaigns, saw not righteousness, but a dangerous new precedent. They saw a Persia that dared to challenge the natural order, a Persia that offered a different path, one that threatened to dismantle their own centuries-old systems of control. And within the heart of Persia itself, the seeds of this new dawn were being sown by a man whose legacy would eclipse even that of Cyrus. A man who, while embodying the might of his people, also articulated a philosophy that would resonate through millennia. His name was Zarathustra, and his teachings, once a fringe belief, were now gaining traction, whispering of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, of a divine judgment, and of a savior yet to come. His prophet, a man named Hystaspes, was a respected member of the Persian court, a confidant of kings. And it was through Hystaspes that the prophet's radical ideas began to seep into the very fabric of the empire. The implications were staggering. If Persia truly represented the forces of good, then its enemies were not merely political rivals, but agents of chaos, of darkness. This wasn't just about conquering territory, it was about spiritual warfare. The stakes, once limited to the borders of the empire, had suddenly expanded to encompass the very soul of the world. And as this new ideology took root, a question began to form, a question that would echo through the centuries. Could a warrior empire truly be the champion of righteousness? Or was this noble ideal merely a gilded cage, destined to become something far more terrible? The whispers of a new dawn were growing louder, but the shadows they cast were also lengthening, hinting at a future far more complex and far more perilous than anyone could have imagined. The legacy of Cyrus the Great, a ruler celebrated for his justice and respect for conquered peoples, cast a long shadow. His son, Cambyses II, inherited an empire stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the edges of India. But Cambyses was a different man. Driven by ambition and perhaps a growing paranoia, he embarked on a campaign that would test the very foundations of the Achaemenid Empire. His target, Egypt. The land of the pharaohs, a civilization as ancient as time itself, stood as the last great independent power in the Near East. For Cambyses, conquering Egypt was not just about adding territory, it was about cementing his own legend, surpassing his father's achievements, and claiming the divine right of kings that flowed through the Nile. The preparations were immense. The Persian army, a force honed by years of conquest, assembled on the border. Camels, essential for crossing the unforgiving desert, were gathered by the thousands. Engineers devised ingenious methods to transport water, the lifeblood of any desert campaign. Cambyses himself, clad in the royal regalia, led the charge, his eyes fixed on the distant pyramids. But the path to Egypt was not merely a physical one. Cambyses found himself entangled in a web of intrigue and dissent within his own court. Whispers began to circulate, rumors of plots and usurpation. The vastness of the empire, once a source of strength, now presented vulnerabilities. Distances were vast, communication slow, and loyalty could be a fragile commodity. At the heart of these whispers was a figure shrouded in mystery, the Magian priest, Gaumata. While Cambyses was away, pursuing his Egyptian ambitions, Gaumata, who bore a striking resemblance to Cambyses' brother, Bardia, whom Cambyses had secretly murdered before leaving Persia, began to impersonate him. He claimed the throne for himself, exploiting the existing discontent and the absence of the king. Imagine the scene. News travels slowly across the sprawling Persian Empire. Messengers, galloping for weeks, arrive with conflicting reports. One arrives from Egypt, speaking of victory and the fall of Memphis. Another, from the heartland, whispers of rebellion, of a new king on the throne, a king who was supposedly dead. Cambyses, basking in his triumph over Egypt, received this news with disbelief, then rage. The empire he had fought to expand was now fracturing from within. The conquest of Egypt, meant to be his crowning achievement, suddenly felt hollow. He had overthrown a foreign dynasty, only to face a far more insidious threat, a serpent coiled in the very heart of his palace. The journey back to Persia was a desperate race against time. But the desert, which had facilitated his advance, now seemed to conspire against his return. Was the empire he knew still there? Or had this impostor, this Gaumata, already woven his lies so deeply into the fabric of Persian society that the truth would no longer matter? The stakes had never been higher. The fate of an empire hung precariously in the balance, and the man who had once stood as its undisputed master now found himself fighting a phantom, a shadow of his own making, for the soul of Persia. The air in Persepolis shimmered with a heat that was more than just the sun. It was the hum of empire, a vast, intricate machine built on conquest, yes, but also on an idea. An idea that set Persia apart. An idea that claimed its kings were touched by the divine. For centuries, the Achaemenid Empire had been a force of nature, its armies sweeping across continents, its administrators weaving a tapestry of governance from the Indus to the Aegean. But the true source of their power, the bedrock of their legitimacy, lay here, in the heart of Persia itself. It was a belief that their rulers were not merely men, but chosen instruments of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism. Imagine it, a king, clad in robes of the finest dyed wool, adorned with gold and lapis lazuli, stepping onto a raised platform. The very ground seemed to vibrate with reverence. Before him, thousands knelt, their faces upturned, their hearts filled with awe. This was not just a king receiving homage. This was a god-king, a mediator between the mortal and the divine. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact inscribed with Akkadian cuneiform, speaks of Cyrus the Great not as a conqueror who imposed his will, but as a liberator, chosen by Marduk, the Babylonian chief god, to restore order and bring peace. Even in conquest, the Persians presented themselves as agents of cosmic justice, not brute force. They were liberators, not oppressors. They rebuilt temples, respected local customs, and allowed conquered peoples to retain their languages and religions. This was a radical departure from the empires that had come before. But this divine mandate came with immense responsibility. The king was expected to uphold Asher, truth, righteousness, and cosmic order. To deviate from this path was not just a political failure, it was a spiritual one, a betrayal of Ahura Mazda himself. The weight of the heavens rested on his shoulders. And as the empire grew, so did the scrutiny. Whispers turned into pronouncements. The king's every action, every decree, was interpreted through the lens of divine will. Rivalries festered, not just for earthly power, but for the favor of the gods. Were the omens favorable? Had a sacrifice been accepted? The spiritual and the political became inextricably intertwined, a volatile cocktail that fueled both unprecedented glory and insidious danger. The magnificent ceremonies at Persepolis, the grand processions, the elaborate rituals, these were not mere displays of wealth. They were affirmations of faith, potent assertions of a divine right to rule. The very stones of the palaces seemed to absorb this sacred energy, radiating an aura of power that echoed across the known world. Yet, beneath this veneer of divine perfection, cracks were beginning to show. The vastness of the empire, the sheer diversity of its peoples, the ever-present threat of rebellion, these were immense challenges. And as the kings grew more isolated, more accustomed to unquestioning obedience, the line between divine guidance and human fallibility began to blur. What happened when the divinely appointed king made a mistake? What when his decrees, meant to uphold Asher, instead sowed discord? The very foundation of their power, their connection to the gods, could become their greatest vulnerability. And in the gilded halls of Persepolis, a shadow was beginning to lengthen, a question that would soon shake the very foundations of the Persian world. Was the divine hand truly guiding them, Or were they merely mortals playing a dangerous game with forces they only thought they controlled? The Persian Empire, a colossus stretching from the sands of Egypt to the foothills of the Himalayas, had achieved a level of power and sophistication rarely seen in the ancient world. Its vast armies, its intricate administrative network, its monumental architecture, all spoke of an empire at its zenith. But even the mightiest empires can be threatened, not always by grand invasions, but by the slow, insidious creep of peoples from the fringes. To the east, beyond the Fertile Crescent and the mountains of Parthia, lay a vast and wild frontier. Here, nomadic tribes, skilled horsemen and fierce warriors, had long been a source of both trade and tribulation for settled civilizations. For centuries, the Persians had maintained a degree of control, a watchful eye over these restless peoples. But now, a new and more formidable threat was emerging from the steppes. These were the Sokha, a confederation of nomadic peoples known for their ferocity and their mastery of mounted warfare. Their riders, clad in leather and bronze, armed with devastating composite bows, could appear and disappear like phantoms across the vast, open plains. For generations, they had been a thorn in the side of the Persian Empire, raiding caravans, harassing border settlements, but never truly challenging the heart of the empire. But something had changed. The Sokha were uniting, their disparate tribes coalescing under powerful chieftains. Driven by internal pressures, or perhaps by a shared ambition, they began to push harder against the Persian frontier, their incursions becoming more frequent, more organized, and more devastating. Persian garrisons, accustomed to dealing with smaller raiding parties, found themselves overwhelmed. Villages burned, and the bounty of the eastern provinces was carried away on the backs of swift horses. The great king, Darius himself, understood the gravity of this new threat. He had spent years consolidating his empire, building roads, establishing satrapies, and fostering a sense of Persian identity. He had faced down rebellions and repelled invasions, but this was different. This was not a single enemy to be met on the battlefield, but a hydra-headed threat that could strike anywhere, at any time. To counter this, Darius embarked on an unprecedented project, a monumental undertaking that would become known as the Great Wall of the East. Not a single, unbroken fortification like the later walls of China, but a series of interconnected fortresses, watchtowers, and fortified settlements stretching for hundreds of miles along the empire's northeastern frontier. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to create an impenetrable barrier against the tide of the steppe. Imagine the scene: legions of laborers, drawn from across the empire, toiling under the harsh sun, their muscles straining as they hauled stone and earth. Persian engineers, drawing upon centuries of military architecture, designed the fortifications, ensuring they were strategically placed to command the passes and valleys. Soldiers stood guard, their bronze helmets glinting, their faces grim, knowing they were the first line of defense against an enemy that knew no mercy. This wasn't just about bricks and mortar, it was a testament to Persian ingenuity and their unwavering resolve. It was a declaration that the empire would not yield, that its borders would be defended at any cost. But as the wall slowly rose, so too did the pressure from beyond. The Sokha, sensing the challenge, intensified their attacks, probing for weaknesses, their mounted warriors circling the nascent defenses like wolves around a struggling flock. The cost of this colossal undertaking was immense, both in terms of manpower and treasure. Yet, the great king pressed on, for he understood the stakes. If the eastern frontier fell, the heart of the empire would be exposed. The wealth, the culture, the very civilization that Persia had so painstakingly built, would be at the mercy of the nomadic hordes. The Great Wall of the East was more than just a defense, it was a symbol of Persian defiance, a desperate stand against the encroaching darkness. But as the sun set on another day of backbreaking labor, a chilling realization began to dawn. Even the mightiest wall might not be enough to hold back the storm. The air in Susa hung thick with the scent of exotic spices and the murmur of 1,000 courtiers. For decades, the Achaemenid Empire had been a beacon of order, a testament to the vision of Cyrus the Great, and the administrative genius of Darius. Its vast reach, from the sun-baked sands of Egypt to the fertile plains of Bactria, was a marvel of human organization. Persian might was not just about legions of immortals or the formidable navy, it was about tolerance, justice, and the recognition of diverse peoples. But even the mightiest empires cast long shadows. And in the heart of this glittering dominion, a chill began to creep in. The successors to Darius, while heirs to his power, lacked his foresight, his understanding of the delicate balance that held such a diverse realm together. Cambyses too, the son and heir, had inherited a magnificent throne, but a troubled mind. His reign, though brief, would be marked by ambition that outstripped his wisdom, and a cruelty that sowed the first seeds of doubt. His conquest of Egypt, intended as a grand statement of Achaemenid supremacy, devolved into something far darker. Tales reached the distant satrapies of desecrated temples, of sacred rites mocked, of a pharaoh's tomb defiled. The very principles of religious tolerance, the bedrock upon which Cyrus had built his empire, seemed to be crumbling. In the eyes of many, Cambyses was no longer the righteous king, but a tyrant driven by hubris. And then came the whispers, growing louder with each passing season. Whispers of rebellion, of a pretender to the throne. A magus, Gaumata, claimed to be Smerdis, the brother of Cambyses, a brother whom Cambyses himself had secretly murdered. This was no mere rumor, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Achaemenid line, a spark thrown onto tinder that Cambyses' harsh policies had ignited. Imagine the shock rippling through the empire. The news arrived in Persepolis, in Babylon, in Sardis. The king, or rather, the man claiming to be the king, was a fraud. And Cambyses, far from Egypt, was racing back, his furious storm gathering on the horizon. But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. On the journey back, Cambyses fell ill, and then, a single, devastating blow. He died. His death, swift and unexpected, plunged the empire into chaos. The fraud Gaumata, now unchallenged, sat upon the throne of Cyrus. He ruled not with the wisdom of his predecessors, but with a tyranny that was swift and brutal. He reversed many of the tolerant policies, striking out at the very peoples who had known peace under Persian rule. This was not the righteous might of the Achaemenids, this was a perversion of it. The empire, built on a foundation of order and respect, was teetering on the brink, not from external invasion, but from an internal rot, a betrayal from within. And the question loomed, could the Achaemenid legacy survive this unthinkable betrayal, this usurpation by a false king? The Persian Empire. A name that once struck fear and awe across the known world. 4 centuries, its shadow stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, a testament to a power unlike any seen before. But empires, like all earthly things, are subject to the relentless march of time. And even the mightiest can stumble. We've seen how Cyrus the Great forged this colossal dominion, a tapestry woven with diverse peoples and cultures, held together by a vision of tolerance and order. We've witnessed the zenith of its power under Darius and Xerxes, their grand ambitions echoing in the marble halls of Persepolis. But with immense power comes immense challenge. Internal strife, ambitious neighbors, and the sheer weight of governing such a vast territory began to fray the edges of this golden age. Imagine, if you will, the heart of this empire. Persepolis, a city built not just of stone, but of aspiration. Its monumental palaces, its intricate carvings depicting processions of tribute-bearers from every corner of the realm, they were more than just architecture. They were a declaration, a statement of unshakable authority, a visual symphony of Persian dominance. Yet, even here, beneath the glittering surface, seeds of discontent were being sown. Rebellions, though often brutally suppressed, were a constant reminder that not all peoples bowed willingly to the great king. And then there were the external threats. The Greeks, a collection of fractious city-states, were proving to be a thorn in the Persian side. Their surprising victories at Marathon and Salamis had shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. While the empire remained formidable, these encounters introduced a new element, doubt. Could this colossus truly be brought down? But the true test of Persia's strength lay not just in its armies, but in its very soul. The core values that had propelled its rise, justice, order, the divine mandate of the king, were they being upheld? Or were they being corrupted by the very power they had created? Whispers began to circulate, tales of decadence, of forgotten principles, of a leadership detached from the realities of its people. The consequences of these internal and external pressures were far-reaching. The vast resources of the empire, once a source of strength, now became a burden, difficult to manage, prone to corruption. The intricate bureaucracy, designed to govern efficiently, became a labyrinth of competing interests, slowing progress, stifling innovation. The very diversity that had been Persia's hallmark began to breed division, as local identities reasserted themselves against the unifying force of imperial rule. And as the empire grappled with these immense challenges, a new, unexpected force was gathering on the horizon. A force that would ultimately challenge not just the military might of Persia, but its very right to exist. A force born from the rugged mountains and the independent spirit of Macedon. The stage was set. The titans of the ancient world were about to collide. And the fate of empires, the legacy of Persia, would be decided on battlefields yet unseen. But before the clash, a revelation. A secret that would shake the foundations of the Persian court and reveal a vulnerability no one dared to imagine. The air in Pasargadae was thick with the scent of cypress and the murmur of 1,000 voices. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, a disquiet was growing. Cyrus, the king of kings, the man who had forged an empire from the ashes of Babylon, was aging. And his sons were a different story. We remember Cyrus as the liberator, the benevolent ruler who allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem, who famously declared, "I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world, son of Cambyses, the great king, king of Anshan, descendant of Tisbes, the great king, king of Anshan, of a family which was always royal." A testament to his power, yes, but also to his philosophy. He saw himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He respected local customs, honored local gods, and integrated conquered peoples into his vast dominion. This was the genius of the Achaemenid Empire, a model of tolerance and cooperation that would influence rulers for centuries to come. But empires, like men, are mortal. And the seeds of their undoing are often sown within their own bloodlines. Cyrus's eldest son, Cambyses, was a man of ambition, but his temperament was volatile. His younger son, Bardia, was quieter, more of an enigma, but no less a figure of contention. The vast empire, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, a tapestry woven with diverse peoples and traditions, was a prize too great for these rival brothers to share. News arrived from the eastern frontiers, from the wild lands beyond the Caspian gates. The nomadic Massagetae, a formidable confederation of horsemen and archers, were stirring. Their queen, Tomaris, a warrior in her own right, a woman forged in the harsh steppe, had heard tales of the Persian might. Tales that spoke of an insatiable hunger for conquest, tales that now threatened her own people. Cyrus, ever the strategist, saw this as more than just a border skirmish. This was a challenge to the very heart of his empire, a test of his legacy. He gathered his finest generals, his most loyal soldiers. The golden splendor of Pasargadae was exchanged for the grim purpose of war. He would march east, to confront this new threat, to secure the eastern flank of his empire, to ensure that the peace he had so painstakingly built would not be shattered by a barbarian queen. But as Cyrus prepared for his campaign, a shadow began to lengthen within the palace walls. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors to chilling pronouncements. A sickness had taken hold of Cambyses, a fever that burned him from within. And as the king lay racked by illness, his ambitious gaze fixed on the throne, a dark deed was contemplated. A deed that would not only plunge the empire into chaos but would set in motion a chain of events so devastating, so utterly consequential, that even the mighty Cyrus could not have foreseen it. The stage was set, not for a glorious victory, but for a betrayal that would shake the foundations of the Achaemenid world to its very core. The empire stretched, vast and seemingly unshakable. 4 generations, the Achaemenids had ruled, their power forged in conquest, their administration a marvel of organization. But with immense power comes immense responsibility, and for the Persians, this responsibility would soon be tested in ways that would echo through millennia. Babylon, the glittering jewel of Mesopotamia, had fallen to Cyrus the Great decades before. Its ancient walls, a symbol of defiance, had crumbled not under brute force alone, but under a strategic brilliance that understood the heart of conquest lay not just in subjugation, but in winning over the conquered. Yet, the legacy of Babylon was complex. It was a city of ancient gods, of intricate rituals, of a people bound by deep-seated traditions. And within its labyrinthine streets, a particular community had found itself adrift, their sacred texts and their very identity threatened by the Babylonian exile. Then came the decree, a proclamation, not of destruction, but of liberation. Imagine the scene: couriers, dispatched across the vast Persian satrapies, carrying news that would reshape the destiny of thousands. Cyrus, the king of kings, the ruler of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, issued an edict that was, for its time, nothing short of revolutionary. He commanded that the exiled peoples, including the Jews who had languished in Babylon for nearly half a century, be allowed to return to their homelands. Not only that, but he decreed that their temples, their sacred spaces, be rebuilt, and their religious practices restored. This wasn't mere political expediency, though there were certainly strategic advantages to fostering loyalty among diverse populations. This was an act of profound tolerance, a recognition that the strength of the empire lay not in forcing uniformity, but in embracing diversity. The Jews, in their writings, would remember Cyrus with reverence, calling him God's anointed. The historian Herodotus, though writing later and from a Greek perspective, noted the Persians' respect for foreign customs and their willingness to incorporate them. But this act, however righteous, did not erase the deep wounds of exile. The journey back to Jerusalem was arduous, a pilgrimage across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. And when they arrived, they found not a thriving city, but a land scarred by neglect, its walls in ruins, its spirit weary. The task before them was monumental: to rebuild not just stones and mortar, but a community, a faith, and a future. The return from Babylon was more than a physical relocation. It was a spiritual rebirth, a complex tapestry woven with threads of hope, hardship, and the dawning realization that their God had worked through a foreign king to orchestrate their deliverance. But the challenges they faced upon their return were immense, and the path ahead would be fraught with internal division and external threats. The seeds of tolerance had been sown, but the harvest would be a long and arduous struggle, a struggle that would test the very foundations of their newly re-established life. What unforeseen dangers lay in wait in a land still reeling from the chaos of its past? For centuries, the echoes of Persia's glory have whispered across the sands of time. We've witnessed the rise of empires, the clash of civilizations, the ingenuity of a people who dared to build a world unlike any other. But as we stand on the precipice of understanding their true legacy, we must confront a crucial question. Was the might of the Persian kings merely the brute force of conquest, or was it something more profound? Something righteous? The grandeur of Persepolis, still standing defiantly against the ages, is a testament to that power. A capital city built not just for governance, but as a living monument to the Achaemenid vision. Here, Darius the Great and Xerxes ruled, not as despots, but as stewards of a vast, multicultural realm. Their administration, a marvel of its time, laid the groundwork for a stable and prosperous empire. Imagine the sheer scale of it. From the sun-baked plains of Egypt to the rugged mountains of Bactria, a tapestry of peoples, languages, and customs united under a single, sophisticated system of governance. This was no mere subjugation. The Persians understood that true strength lay not in crushing dissent, but in fostering cooperation. Royal inscriptions, meticulously carved into stone, reveal a philosophy that prioritized justice and order. Darius, in his own words, proclaimed, "By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am a king who desires righteousness. I am not a friend to the wicked, I am not a friend to the lie. I am not a friend to the destructive, I am not a friend to the evil." These were not just empty pronouncements. The Persians established a standardized system of coinage, a unified legal framework, and even a postal service that allowed for swift communication across their immense territory. They respected local customs and religions, allowing conquered peoples to retain their traditions. This policy of tolerance, so alien to many empires before and since, was a cornerstone of their success. It fostered loyalty, minimized rebellion, and allowed for the flourishing of diverse cultures within the Persian fold. The Jews, returning from Babylonian captivity, found a sanctuary in Persia, allowed to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, a testament to this enlightened approach. At the heart of this philosophy lay Zoroastrianism, a faith that emphasized the eternal struggle between good and evil, truth and falsehood. This moral compass guided their rulers, encouraging them to strive for justice, generosity, and the well-being of their subjects. The very name Persia became synonymous with a civilization that valued not just power, but probity. The might of Persia was undeniable. But its true righteousness lay in its vision of a unified world, built on principles of justice, tolerance, and order. While empires rise and fall, and conquerors are often remembered for their brutality, the legacy of the Achaemenid kings offers a different narrative. It is a story of a civilization that understood that true power is not measured by the extent of one's dominion, but by the quality of one's rule and the enduring impact of one's ideals.